All right, folks, welcome back to the second half of our webinar series for today. Dr. Panisi?
Thanks, Richie. I was like, is he going to introduce Eric or am I going to? I'll be happy to. All right. Uh, Welcome back, everyone. And for the second hour of today's GT Bob, we have our brand new entomologist in Griffin, Dr. Erich Schoeller, who is an assistant professor of entomology at the University of Georgia and has expertise in research and extension of integrated pest management of insects and mites affecting ornamental and vegetable crops in greenhouses and vertical farms. Dr. Schoeller has over 10 years of experience developing and implementing biological control programs for arthropod pests in urban landscapes and indoor agriculture. And he's also a former gator like me, but he's a dog now. Eric? All right, you can go ahead and get started.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about biocontrol of insects and pests in protected agriculture. On here. All right. So just sort of a brief introduction. I'll do an introduction to integrated pest management. I'll talk a little bit about scouting basics. I'll talk about some of the major controlled environment groups pests that are a concern. I'll then go into talking about some of the biological control options for those pests, and then finally discuss some conclusions. So hopefully a lot of you have heard the word IPM, and if not, I'll introduce that briefly. So integrated pest management, or IPM, it's a decision-based system based on scientific research. And the aim of integrated pest management is to reduce the pest management products that we use for our production systems. And at the same time, trying to make the products that we're using more ecologically sound and safe for human use. And sort of the basis of IPM is prevention. And prevention is the most important thing we can do to manage pests. And in prevention systems, there are typically things like agricultural practices, such as crop rotation, using resistant varieties and other things like that. So it's really important to, as a foundation for integrated pest management, to use those systems to prevent anything from happening in the first place. And following those prevention things with really good monitoring and decision support systems, and when we actually have to take action for when we are detecting pest management problems. As most of you are aware, it's nearly impossible to never have to manage pests. So once we come to that conclusion that we have to do something about the pests that we have, now we have to go into the control phase. The control phase is sort of a three-tiered system where we're looking at the effectiveness of certain control tactics as well as their potential risks. And then these control methods should really, start with mechanical control, such as trapping, physically removing infested material, followed by using biological control options, which are typically more costly, but also more comprehensive in their effectiveness. And the last thing we want to do is use chemicals. And if we have to use chemicals, our first line of defense is biorational chemicals, so something that is relatively safe. And our last resort is having to use, conventional insecticides. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on talking about these biological control options as well as scouting for the pest issues that we're having. So why is integrated pest management becoming so important in our crop production systems? And the primary reason for that is a desire to reduce our reliance on chemical pesticides. And the reasons that we want to reduce our reliance on chemical pesticides is because there's fewer and fewer pesticides available to us every year. It's becoming harder and harder for companies to register pesticides, and there's just a big bottleneck on new products entering the system. Not only is it harder to register new pesticides, but the EPA is also constantly deregistering products that you're using on a regular basis. So it's just there's less and less things for growers to use every year. And when you have less options, that can lead to other problems, which we'll talk about in a second. Some of these new products are often more expensive because it costs these companies a lot more money these days to develop. And there's also concerns with worker safety. As I mentioned, with the loss of chemistries available for us to manage pests, there's a big concern over developing resistance in pests. And we see this all the time. I'll just sort of highlight one of the most obvious things that we've seen over the years, and that's with managing whiteflies in controlled environments. One of the biggest pests in greenhouses is the sweet potato whitefly, Babesia tabaci. What you might not know, however, is there's basically cryptic species, meaning multiple species that we're experiencing that really can't tell apart unless we do molecular testing. And there are big ecological and behavioral differences between these species. And one of the things that's a big problem is there's differences in their resistance as well. So our historical species, which is what we call the bee biotype, that originates from the Middle East, and that's resistant to a lot of the products that we use. However, we have a more recent variety that's shown up in the last 20 years, and that's what we call the Q biotype, which is from the Mediterranean. And this is resistant to a lot of pyrethroids as well as some of the neonicotinoid pesticides that we're using. And so when we're spraying our greenhouse to manage whiteflies, we're knocking down the bee, but we're not knocking down the Q. So we keep spraying and spraying and spraying. We're developing resistance that way because we're not using the right compounds to manage both. So creating pesticide-resistant populations is something that's really a concern these days. So for me, in my career, I work in controlled environments, and I find it a really fascinating system to work in, particularly working in ornamentals and floriculture. It's a lot different than trying to manage pests and your field crops. So in greenhouses with floriculture, obviously you're worrying a lot about the aesthetic value of things, and when you're worrying about the aesthetic value of things, this can create a much lower threshold for tolerance for dealing with pests. So you have to really create a very clean environment when you're working for things that you're selling for their appearance. Also, typically in greenhouses, unlike the field, which you might have one or two crops that are co-cropped, you can have dozens or not even hundreds in some of the larger operations, different plants or cultivars that you're growing in a very small area. And when you have a lot of things in a very small area, the practices that you're using to manage pests may not all work equally well. So it can get really complicated there. And when you have a lot of different pests on a lot of different crops, you can be dealing with a lot of different pesticides. And this can really create a complicated system for really managing pests in the way that you need to. And when you're thinking about biological control, where you're introducing natural enemies into a greenhouse or other enclosed system, those are semi-closed systems that they can't really freely move in and out of very easily. So when you introduce a natural enemy to suppress a pest population, they might control the pest very well, but then their populations are going to collapse because they have nothing else to feed on, and they can't move to the outside environment to seek additional resources. So being able to find ways to support natural enemy populations for long periods so they're not spending money constantly buying them and releasing them is a real challenge. So I first want to talk about scouting, which is sort of the step right before actually having to control the pests. And this is a really important thing to understand and catch pest population outbreaks before they become a problem. And scouting's not only looking for pest issues, but it's also looking for diseases at the same time. As Bodie talked about, looking for nutrient issues, looking at heist management, irrigation issues, and also just understanding what the stage of the crop is. And when scouting really involves walking around the crop, examining all aspects of it, such as the flowers, roots, stems, and even the leaves. And there's typically 5 steps that I think are important for scouting. So one of them is prepping the greenhouse for scouting. The second, which we just talked about, is inspecting plants, monitoring for pests. And it's really important to keep good records as well as train your staff for doing these activities, because you can't, as a grower, be out there all the time looking at plants. So the first step, as I mentioned, is prepping your greenhouse for the actual scouting activities. And it's important to note that before you do any scouting activities or even enter your greenhouse for any other reason, it's important to follow sanitary guidelines so that you're not moving contaminated products around the greenhouse. So planning on knowing where you typically have problem areas and moving into those last, so you're not tracking pests throughout the greenhouse, moving into sort of entrances first and then doing the interior later, so you're not transporting pests and infected material. Sanitation is a very important initial step when you're starting the scouting process. So once you've kept that in mind, sort of the first step in scouting is to divide your greenhouse into what is a system that makes sense to you in terms of how it's laid out. So here you can see an example of a greenhouse here in Georgia. Pure Flavor, they have about 25 acres of indoor tomatoes. Now, how would you logically divide this up into a monitoring program? You might do them by an acre at a time. You might do them by rows. It's really up to you how you want to do this, but you just need to do something that makes sense to you so that you can keep good records on what areas correspond to what in the greenhouse for pest issues. And it's important to know before you start scouting what the normal looks like for your crop so that when you see something, you know that it's unusual and you can investigate further. So once you've laid out the grid of your greenhouse and how you want to scout it, then you can start inspecting your plants. And as I mentioned, this involves looking over the entire crop. You're looking for its color, its uniformness, and its height, so that you should know, again, as I mentioned, you should know what the normal should look like, not only for the whole crop cycle, but also at individual stages, what is normal. So you can immediately identify what is something you need to come back to and investigate further. And this is typically something that's a cursory or a very quick examination. Is typically important to use some of these tools that I show here, these magnifying glasses, so that you can really look at things up close. And you need to inspect the whole plant because insects are divided on the plant on very different areas. So under the leaves, on the stem, in the flowers, there are insects that like to congregate in all these different areas, and you might not catch them unless you're looking at the entire plant. Again, don't forget to look at the soil. There are plenty of soil-dwelling pests, and this is something that growers overlook a lot. And something I just sort of wanted to point out is, in the past, this is a very labor-intensive process. It can involve many IPM specialists that are working in your greenhouse. But as our technology evolves, there are more and more ways to make this as an easier process. Some of the things we're seeing in research and in the bigger operations these days is using sort of precision agriculture to inspect your crop. Some of the things that we have available are cameras. These can be put on drones or in the railing systems of your greenhouse, and you can pretty much take pictures of your entire crop in a very quick manner. We have fancy cameras these days that can really see things that we can't see with our own eyes. So we can tell here in the center is a disease transmission or disease process in a plant, and it's typically not visible until the very late stages. But these cameras, they can detect disease processes very, very early in the crop, and you can get those taken care of early because a lot of times insects are feeding on these plants and moving them through the greenhouse. And if you let infected plants persist in your greenhouse for a long time, that spread can get really out of control. Another really thing that's useful is using sticky cards, and it's really important to scout frequently. And so one of the ways that you can expedite that is for doing pretty much non-labor intensive activities, such as just collecting or looking at the traps that you have laid out. And it's pretty important to put these out in a sufficient amount of numbers that you get really good coverage. And we recommend putting these out about for every 1,000 square foot. And depending on your crop, these need to either be at crop level, slightly above the canopy, or even sometimes in the upper part of your greenhouse. And outside of your normal scouting activities, it's pretty good to check these sort of in extra intervals when you've used biological control, just to make sure that you can see those agents moving out through your greenhouse to make sure that they're working well. Again, Even this now is becoming automated. So we now have camera systems and basically AI software that can tell us what's actually on these cards, and they can identify them to groups. So here you can see a picture that is looking at the number of thrips and whitefly on a card, and the software can pick out each single individual and do a count and tell you exactly how many insects you have on that card without spending hours counting. And those are going to be important for developing economic thresholds for planning on doing different treatments. As I mentioned, keeping proper records is critical. And it's really important that you're taking good notes so that you're knowing where the issues are in your greenhouse, so you can monitor hotspots, you can monitor what stages of the pest are present, and really looking also at what the current environment in the greenhouse is, because as it gets warmer in your greenhouse, those issues might develop more quickly. So having sort of an understanding on where the temperature is going and where the populations are growing are going to help inform you when you need to intervene and try to manage those pest populations. And finally, nothing's more important than having very well-trained staff. And having these detail-oriented employees should really help save you money and control pests better over time than untrained employees or just less employees in general that can be dedicated to doing scouting activities. And the more eyes you have, the quicker that you can catch problems. And I personally recommend going in yourself and assessing the capabilities of your employees just to double check that they're doing a good job. All right, so now moving into another topic, which is looking at some of the pest groups of concern. As I mentioned early on with that one example, whiteflies are probably the biggest pest in controlled environments that we have to deal with. They can build up in very, very high numbers, as you can see here on the leaves. All right, so these are the nymphs, and right here on the right are the whiteflies. And you can basically, in really bad situations, get thousands of individuals a leaf. They're sucking the nutrients out of your plants. And as they're feeding on your plants, they're excreting a sugary substance because they can't handle all the sugar in there. They're looking for other compounds in the plant. So the excess sugar that they're getting from their feeding, they excrete with this really sugary substance we call honeydew. And that honeydew, if left to its own fruition, can promote the growth of mold on your plant. And that mold is not only unappealing to your customers, but it can also block photosynthesis. So keeping these sap-sucking insects off your plants is pretty important. So what are the whiteflies you really have to pay attention to? Well, 99% of your problems in greenhouses are going to be these two species. The first is the sweet potato or silverleaf whitefly, as we call it, Bemisia tabaci. The other one's called the greenhouse whitefly, which is Trialrodes vaporarium. They're very small, about 2 or 3 millimeters each. And here's kind of how do you tell the difference between these two? So sweet potato / silverleaf whitefly, they hold their wings sort of at a tent-shaped fashion. Greenhouse whitefly, on the other hand, their wings are held flat. This is only something you're going to be able to see if you're looking at them under magnification on the leaf. The nymphs, which are their immature stages, they also differ in their appearance. The sweet potato whitefly, their nymphs do not have sort of a fringed appearance from the wax on the outside, while the greenhouse whitefly does. And both of these are going to be something that anyone growing in a greenhouse is going to have pretty consistent problems with. And there are differences in their management, which is why I sort of made a point of distinguishing between them. So another thing that pretty much every greenhouse grower has to deal with at some point is fungus gnats and shore flies. Now, these are mainly a problem during the propagation phase, where you have to keep a higher moisture in your soil because the larvae, so the adults are laying their eggs on the soil surface, and then the larvae are moving through the soil, and they're typically feeding on microorganisms such as algae. So if you have a lot of algae in your soil, that's something that's really going to attract fungus gnats. But once they run out of that food, in the case of fungus gnats, they're going to start feeding on the roots of your plants, which can prevent the roots from taking up moisture. And you can see here on the bottom, that can lead to wilting. Soil moisture management is sort of your first line defense against them. But again, it's really a propagation thing. But if you're overwatering your container plants too, it can also be a problem. It's important to note that there's a big difference between fungus gnats and shore flies. Fungus gnat larvae are damaging, shore fly larvae are not. So if you can tell them apart, which in the case of fungus gnats, they have a really long antenna. These shore flies have really short antenna, and they tend to be, these are about 1.5 to 2 times the size of the fungus gnats. So being able to tell them apart can help you reduce the cost of managing. In the adult stages, they do not cause damage to your plant. They are only an aesthetic problem. If you're selling your product and it has a whole bunch of flies coming off it, obviously your growers don't appreciate that, but they're not going to be damaging your plant. So you can treat them close to shipment, which is generally recommended, but doing anything else for them is not often worth your time. So that kind of leaves up that to you to deal with that. Another really big group of pests are thrips. These are really small insects as well, typically no more than 4 millimeters. Different species really like to hang out on different areas of the plant. There are some species that really like to hang out on the flowers. There are other species that really like to hang out in the foliage. As you're scouting, it's often a good practice to blow on the flowers because your breath is producing CO2, and that can agitate the thrips. And if there's anything hiding in the flowers, oftentimes they'll come running out, and that will help you determine whether or not you've got flower thrips. Another big characteristic is this sort of scraping away of the tissue on the leaves. And some species are also produce this black speckle fecal matter, which is a very characteristic sign that you have thrips. Now, there's so many different thrip species which are problematic in a greenhouse. I just want to sort of highlight 4 of them, what I think are probably one of the more important ones. The granddaddy of all the important thrips is the western flower thrips here in the southeast or even globally. They are a huge problem. There are rather large thrips. But the problem is you have a lot of thrips that look very similar to each other. They're generally yellow in appearance, and it's often hard for growers to tell them apart. I'll just sort of highlight one of the big differences. So onion thrips, also called tobacco thrips, are another thrips you'll see in your greenhouse a lot. The differences here, which you can really only see under magnification, is they have simple eyes that are between their primary eyes. I don't know if you can see this. Here's sort of an illustration. Western flower thrips is red. Onion thrips is gray. The problem with misidentification is western flower thrips is very resistant to pesticides. So if you spray it, it's not often going to be very effective. Tobacco thrips or onion thrips is pretty susceptible to a lot of pesticides. So we have this saying, if the ocelli is gray, go ahead and spray. If they are red, use biologicals instead, which western flower thrips is pretty well managed with biological control. Another species which is working its way up into Georgia, been a big problem in Florida for a long time, is chili thrips. They're smaller than western flower thrips. Unlike western flower thrips, which feeds in the foliage or feed in the flowers primarily, these guys are foliage feeders, and they also pupate in the leaves, which makes them easier to manage, while the western flower thrips, they drop into the soil of pupate, which makes managing that stage rather difficult. And finally, poinsettia thrips, or also known as the patient thrips, really large thrips. They're really black, so they're pretty easy to identify. But they're hard to manage with biological control because they have really good defenses against predators. They're much better managed with chemicals. Something I just wanted to point out that I hope all of you sort of keep an eye out here is this new invasive thrips called Thrips parvospinus, making its way up through Florida. It'll probably be here shortly. It was just detected in the northern counties of Florida. It is both a really devastating field crop pest. It's really bad for pepper growers. but it is also an ornamental and greenhouse vegetable pest. Once we get it, it's going to be a big problem. So we don't have it yet, but expect within the next year to 3 years, it will be here in Georgia. It's just a matter of time. It is getting brought up here through ornamental trade in the box stores. So it's already in Michigan, it's already in Canada. It's leapfrogged us through ornamental trade. So that's just another horror that's kind of on our border. Sort of one of the hardest groups to pest to manage is mealybugs. They're pretty characteristic in their identification because they just produce this really copious amounts of wax. And at really high numbers, they are creating this sort of matte appearance. And this wax really helps prevent them from getting pesticide on their bodies, which makes them hard to manage with pesticides. And when they get really high numbers, much like white flies, or even more like white flies, they can really cause the plant to decline through their feeding activity. Here are really the three main ones you have to worry about in greenhouses: citrus mealybug, Madeira mealybug, and long-tail mealybug. There is occasional other species that are problematic, such as Mexican mealybug, but these are kind of your big three. You can tell them apart. So citrus mealybug has this characteristic dark stripe or bare stripe down the back, which the Madeira mealybug does not have. Madeira mealybug has sort of this medium long waxy tail. And then in the case of the long-tailed mealybug, as its name suggests, it has this really long waxy filaments coming off the back. So all here, what you're seeing is the females. Right here on the right, this is a male mealybug. The males can fly, the females cannot, and they look very different from each other. So when you see these guys, that is not a different pest that you're dealing with. That's just a male mealybug. The females send out pheromones. The males pick those up, and then they fly to the females and mate with them. The females do not really move plant to plant across long distances. Sometimes I see growers seeing this on their crop, and they get really confused, thinking that they have mealybugs. But this is not a mealybug. This is called the mealybug destroyer larvae. They mimic mealybugs. They look just like mealybugs, but they're actually a predatory beetle, which is something that you want in your crop. They are moving around, feeding on things like mealybugs, aphids, and other important pests. And here's what the larvae look like, and here's what the adult looks like. If you see something, as I mentioned, the females don't really move around that much. If you see something cruising along your plant that looks like a mealybug, that's probably a mealybug destroyer larva. But it's important to check anyway. Pick them up, put them on your hand. If they move across your hand very fast, you've got mealybug destroyer. Aphids are another really big problem. Again, like white flies, mealybugs, they are sucking the fluid out of your plant. They are typically aggregated towards more of new growth, and they produce a lot of honeydew, just like white flies. The real problem with aphids is they have a really unique reproduction method called telescopic generations. Basically, they can reproduce without mating, and you have basically the daughters here. They're the parent here. They already have a daughter being developed inside their body as they are young. And even the daughter has a granddaughter inside them. So you have 3 generations within the same individual developing at the same time. So they can produce a huge amount of individuals very quickly. One of the characteristic things to look for in aphid infestations, as I mentioned, they're often up in the buds or in new leaves. Look for the white exuvia that's being produced when they're shedding their skins. They tend to stick to the leaf, a very characteristic sign that you've got aphid problems. So here are the big 4 in terms of aphid species of issues. You've got the potato aphid, green peach aphid, melon aphid, and foxglove aphid. 2 of the species have this sort of concave head. 2 of them have this convex head. Potato aphid is identified by sort of this dark stripe down its back. So if it's got a convex head, dark stripe, it's potato aphid. It's got a convex head without a stripe, not potato aphid. Then for the convex head ones, this species has these structures here. These are called the cornicles. In the melon aphid, they're black. and the foxglove aphid, they're green. So those are kind of the main distinguishing features here between the aphid species. And these are managed differently, especially with biocontrol. So again, it's really important to know what species you're dealing with. Another really nasty group of pests that you have to deal with are spider mites. Spider mites can get really high populations on your plants. When they get high enough population, they start spinning this webbing, and they have sort of a feeding behavior where they are basically scraping the leaf tissue off the leaves, and they create this sort of tissue paper look to the leaves. Very characteristic of mite feeding. So this here is probably the most important species in greenhouses. This is a two-spotted spider mite. Just kind of burn this picture into your mind here for a second. So they have these two dark spots on their sides. Again, two dark spots. A lot of time growers ask me, they see this red mite, right? So typically you kind of deal with this creamy or green colored mite. They see this red mite crawling on their plants, and they think it's a different species. But it's not a different species. This is just the overwintering form of spider mite or two-spotted spider mite. So when the day length gets short enough, they transition into a stage where their body changes color, and they basically become inactive in the winter. So you don't have a different species, you just have an overwintering form on your plant. Lewis mites, another really important mite species. I told you to kind of pay attention to the two-spotted spider mite. So here's kind of the pattern differences. So Lewis mite has these 4 spots instead of the 2 side spots on the body. Unlike two-spotted spider mites, Lewis mite does not enter overwintering or a dipause. So they will feed on their crop the entire year. They do produce less webbing, and they're more of a problem in greenhouses than they are on field crops or nurseries, which two-spotted spider mite can also be a problem. Another really kind of annoying group of mites is the cyclamen and broad mites. They are really, really small mites. They are less than half the size of spider mites, which are small to begin with. Even with, your hand lens, they can be really hard to find. Broad mites have this kind of weird eggs that kind of look like polka dot. They have all this white spots on them. The cyclamen mites do not. So if you got a super tiny mite that's on your plant that has these eggs, so you've got broad mite. If they don't have this color kind of egg, then you've got cyclamen mites. Unlike two-spotted spider mite, which really will feed on the whole the whole plant, these cyclamen mites and broad mites, they really like the meristematic tissues, so they kind of feed on that, and they can cause twisted, hardened, really distorted growth. Unlike a lot of that, the paper damage that you see with the two-spotted spider mite. All right, so those are really your major group of pests that controlled environment growers are having to deal with. So now I want to transition into biological control. So many of you have probably heard the term biological control, but I just want to define that quickly. Biological control is the use of living organisms to try to suppress pests below economically damaging thresholds that they would be otherwise. And typically this is done through the action of humans, right? And ideally, we're doing this so we don't have to use pesticides, or we can at least use pesticides less frequently. But again, that isn't always the case. But this should always be an option that you look at as part of a solid IPM strategy. There's a couple different types of biocontrol. Sort of the classical biological control is when we have a pest that's a lot of times invasive, and what we do is we go back to the native country that these things came with. When they come to the US, a lot of times their predators don't come with them. So we have to go back to the native country, find those predators, bring them back here, and reestablish that predator-prey relationship. And that is classical biocontrol. Conservation biological control is just using tactics to support your native populations of predators, or it could be your non-native populations. It's just things like planting cover crops, floral resources, other things that help support those populations. And then within both those, there's sort of a subcategory of tactics called augmentative biological control. So this is just performing additional releases to biocontrol, so that's inoculative. Or if you want to use biologicals in sort of a way that pesticides use, you inundate them into the crop at really high levels so that they just basically clean up the crop really quickly. So some of the biocontrol options we have are predatory beetles, and they're pretty diverse. So predatory beetles tend to be generalist predators, meaning that feed on a lot of different things. But we do have specialist predatory beetles as well. So beetles from the genus Delphastus, those are whitefly specialists. So they pretty much only feed on whiteflies, and they do a really good job of it. There's a couple different species that are whitefly specialists here in the Southeast. I starred this one, Delphastus catalinae. That's the most common species, and that's the one that's commercially available for you. There are some mealybug specialist species, Diomus astrinus and that Cryptolaemus montezuri, so that mealybug destroyer, which I already showed you. These ones you can use to target mealybugs. So here, this is what's called an oversac. So mealybugs lay these waxy sacs, which all their eggs are in, and the larvae of the beetles basically go into those sacs and eat all the eggs inside. So they're really good predators. We have some roll beetles or staphylinids. So Athena curaria is something that we use. These are the ones that live in the soil. So we can use these to target fungus gnat larvae. We can use these to target some of the thrip species that pupate in the soil. As I mentioned, western flower thrips does that. Roof aphids and also shore flies. So if you've got something in the soil, these are a good option for managing soil pests. So these predatory beetles are pretty diverse in their utility. Another really big group of biological control agents we have are parasitic wasps. Again, these are typically not generalists. These are typically specialist predators. So you have a group that really will only attack one type of pest. You have whitefly specialists, things like Eretmocerus americus and things like Acarcia formosa. So if you have, as I said early in the presentation, it's important to distinguish between those whitefly species because you have parasitoids that are used for different ones. So if you've got the sweet potato or sweet silverleaf whitefly, you want to use this Eretmocerus species. Or if you have greenhouse whitefly, you want to use Acarcia. Okay, and both of these are commercially available separately, so it's important to know which species you have. As I mentioned, mealybugs are really hard to control with pesticides, but we do have some biocontrol options. In the previous slide, I just mentioned there's some beetles for that. But we also do have parasitoids that are specialists on mealybugs. One of those is Anagyrus lowacki. For aphids, we have aphid specialized parasitoids, mainly in the genus Aphidius. So we have Aphidius culminae and Aphidius urvi. Depending on the aphid species, you have to use different wasps. If you have green peach aphid or melon aphid, you have to use Aphidius culminae. If you have pea aphid or potato aphid, you need to use urvi. And that's because these aphid species differ in size, and so do the parasitoids. If you have a large aphid species, you have to use a large parasitoid. So knowing which aphid you have is critical for selecting the correct parasitoid. So just a little bit on using parasitoids. So I mentioned these are all commercially available, the ones I just suggested. For these whitefly parasitoids, these are typically sold on these cards. So here's a close-up. They take the parasitized whitefly nymphs and glue them to this card. Right? Typically, whitefly nymphs are white, but when they become parasitized by these adults, they turn black. So these are all parasitized whitefly nymphs, and these whiteflies, as they develop, they'll emerge from these cards and move into your crop. It's important to test the viability of the product that you're buying. So take one of the cards that you buy, put them in a jar with a sticky card, and make sure that you see emergence of the whitefly or of the parasitoids before you put them in the crop, so that you know that you're actually putting something viable out there to manage your pests. As I mentioned, those whitefly parasitoids work on different species, and what we typically do is, because both those whiteflies are almost always present together, we release a 1-to-1 ratio of the Encarsia and the Eretmoceras, right? And as I mentioned, they're used for different species. Typically 1 adult for every square foot, which kind of corresponds to about 1 card for every 500 square foot of growing space. And we do that about every 2 weeks. Another really sort of interesting group of biocontrol agents are these entomopathogenic nematodes. So these are worms that are parasitizing or infecting insects. They kind of look nondescript. Here's kind of your typical nematode. They just look like a little worm. But what's interesting is different species really differ in their behavior. You have species that are ambush predators. So they basically sit and wait for something to come along, and then they pounce on them. Then you have species that are basically active searching predators. So they're actually moving through the soil and looking for things to feed on. So things that are sit and wait predators, such as Steinernema, so there's a couple of species there. We use those for fungus gnats. So just to clarify, these are targeting pests in the soil, right? So things like fungus gnats, things like turf grass pests are really what we use for these ambush predators. These active searching ones, which are in this genus, we use for things like white grubs, cutworms, and weevils. So knowing what pests you have in the soil is important for selecting the species that you're using. How do we use these nematodes? We typically apply them through the irrigation systems in the greenhouse. If you're a small grower, what makes most sense is typically using a backpack sprayer. You can also use a boom sprayer. This is pictured here. You've got a really large operation. You can also dip, if you're really targeting pests in the soil during the propagation phase, you can dip plug trays directly into nematode solutions. So if you're using these in irrigation, it's important to keep your pressure low. If it's too high, over 200 psi, that will kill the nematodes. And you have to make sure that you're using filters that allow them to pass through the irrigation system. So if you're applying them with a foliar spray over backpack sprayer, make sure you go through again, use some water so that you wash them down into the soil. If you're using them in irrigation, do not tank mix them. Have them in a separate container, so alongside your fertilizer, so they're not sitting in solution for very long. And you need to make sure, because nematodes are much more dense than water, they're going to fall to the bottom, that you're constantly mixing and aerating that solution so they're suspended for when you're irrigating. Typically recommend about 500,000 nematodes per meter square every 2 weeks. And oftentimes we suggest a mixture of different species. Another group of biological control agents that are important are these. We talked about entomopathogenic nematodes in the previous slide. Here's fungi. These are fungi that feed on insects. A couple of different species that are commercially available. So one species, Bavaria bassiana, which is what's typically sold at Botanigard. Another species is Cordyceps formosia. Many of you have maybe heard the name Isaria. This is now Cordyceps. We spray this on the plant, and basically these fungi, they infect the plants and then they spread all over the crop. And fungi need a really high humidity, so that's kind of one of the constraints with using fungi. How do we use it? You can, depending on the pest that you're targeting, you can use foliar sprays, or you can actually dip the plants. So using foliar sprays or dips, you need to make sure that you're getting the right formulations. So if you're using foliar sprays, you need to make sure you've got either like Botanigard ES or their Cerid formulations, because of those emulsifiable solutions. They're up in solution. If you're doing dips, you want the wettable powder formulations for that. So make sure that you're selecting the correct formulations. What's nice about the fungi is often they're compatible with some of the biologicals. Not often with the larger ones, but if you're using predatory mites, that is something that you can use in conjunction with predatory mites. Predatory bugs, these are another group of generalist predators. They are piercing, sucking predators. They work on a variety of different things. Thrips, whiteflies, aphids. One of the big ones that's commercially available is this Aureus insidiosus. But we also have Discophis asperus, available. Sort of a note of caution with using Aureus is this species will enter diapause or hibernation when the day lengths are too short. So if you're using it or trying to use it in the fall or winter, you need to make sure that either supplemental greenhouse lighting or you're using something different, right? The problem with using predatory bugs, if you don't have supplemental resources for them, they often don't perform very well. So Aureus, they really do well when you have a crop that has flowers. So they feed on pollen in addition to the predators that you're using. If you're using Disophis, they like to feed on plant sap as well. And one of the things that growers use is these mullein plants. So here in this picture, you can see in a tomato production system, all these mulleins planted on the periphery of the tomato operation. And oftentimes using these bugs is really useful in conjunction with other biologicals. We typically recommend using them preventatively rather than curatively at about a quarter to a half individual per 10 square feet. If you have to use them curatively, we're talking about double to 4 times that, and release them every 2 weeks. The other really important group is predatory mites, and these are also very diverse in what they're useful for. If you're targeting whiteflies, a species such as Amblyseus swirsky, super useful. They feed on the eggs and nymphal stages of mites. If you're dealing with thrips, you might want to use something like Neoceolus cucumeris, but these are only useful for the larval stages of thrips. If you have the adults, you need to really use those predatory bugs. If you have adults, thrips that are from small species, you can use Amblyseus swirsky for that, but they have to be a small species like chili thrips, not a large species like western flower thrips. They cannot handle preying on those large species. For mites, the granddaddy biocontrol agent for mites is this Phytoceolus persimilis. It does an amazing job of that. It will not manage other mites, only spider mites. So if you have Lewis mites, broad mites, or cyclamen mites, you have to use something else, such as Neoceolus californicus. You release mites a couple of different ways. You can buy them commercially in these sachets. So shown here, they're typically formulated with brand. And inside these sachets, they have sugar mites, which the mites feed on. As they run out of resources in these sachets, they move out into the crop. You can also apply them with this shaker bottle instead, if you so choose, with the same formulations. We always recommend using them preventatively. If you use them curatively, it could take weeks for them to take effect. Another way that I kind of want to transition into sort of this final part of my talk is using banker plant systems to release natural enemies. Now, a banker plant is a crop that directly or indirectly provides resources for the predator, such as food, other type of food, such as pollen, prey, or it could do something else, such as releasing, or it's actually like an oppositional substrate. And these are deliberately put into the cropping system. And this is something that works really well for mites. Mites do not like to reproduce on plants. They do not have a lot of trichomes. You can see here, they love laying their eggs on leaf hairs. If there's no leaf hairs, they produce much less eggs. Something that works really well for that is ornamental peppers. There's a ton of different ornamental pepper varieties that you can select from. Here's just a couple examples. I see growers using black pearl a lot, and I also see growers using this red missile a lot. And one of the nice things about that is they look great. If you're doing this in the landscape, you can plant it right alongside your landscape and not really detract from what you're trying to do there. You can also use banker plant systems for parasitoids. Here's a banker plant system for targeting aphids. So this species called the bird cherry oat aphid only attacks grass species, such as oats and wheat, so they will not get on your crop. You can infest this with the bird cherry oat aphid. These parasitoids will build up populations on your bird cherry oat aphid, and then you can see here, they're up on the structure of the greenhouse. They will move into the crop as they build up their populations. Just one final example for whiteflies. So this is a papaya banker plant system. So what you're doing is you're growing papaya whitefly, which only attacks papaya. It will not get on your vegetable crops. You're releasing things like the Erythromosterus or Incarcia. They're parasitizing the papaya whitefly, moving into your vegetables and managing the whitefly that's feeding on your vegetable crops. And oftentimes we do this not only with parasitoids, but also those predatory beetles as well, which can enhance the control that you're getting. So just to conclude, I hope I convinced you that controlled environment agriculture poses many unique pest management challenges compared to things that you typically see in field crops. And we're really transitioning towards much more of a sustainable pest management operations due to the loss of products that we're seeing, but also the environmental and health consequences of using chemicals. And because growers are losing a lot of products, they're having less chemicals to use, so they're rotating less, and we're seeing a lot of resistance development. So we want to find ways to not have to rotate in things that aren't chemicals. And now these days, after 20, 30 years of development, integrated pest management is a well-developed field. It's very well researched. We have a lot of good data for very precise recommendations for finding alternatives to pesticide use. So with that, I will end it there, and I'll be taking any questions that you have, and I hope you enjoyed my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Erich. This was great. Lots of information, food for thought, and thank you for bringing all this new technology and new information to our audience. We have about a couple of minutes, so I'm going to let people put something in the chat.
I want to just promote one thing. I do have a survey here. If you have high tunnels, greenhouses, vertical farms, I'm trying to do a needs assessment. Please take this. If you've got time, I would really appreciate it.
Could you go ahead and put it up on the screen? Is it
Oh, sorry.
a QR code?
There you go. This QR code right here.
Great. We have a question in the chat. Brian asked, could you share some sources for biological control products?
Yes. The biggest one nationally is Colpert. They are based out of Michigan. They have a huge staff. They are the biggest nationally. I've found them to be very, very well read and very proficient in their recommendations. You have companies like BioBest, which is slightly smaller, but then you have other much smaller suppliers, such as Greenhouse Grower Supply. There's 20 or 30 different smaller ones in the US, but the two I mentioned, BioBest, BioBee, Colpert are your big three. Those smaller operations are sometimes the ones you can get specialty control agents for that the bigger ones don't want to waste their resources on. So if you have something very specific, you can look towards those smaller producers. I'll write the names in the chat.
Yeah, especially the Kipper. That's a little bit harder to figure out what the spelling is on that one. There's Colpert, BioBest, BioBee. Great. Thank you so much, Erich. And that concludes today's session. Thank you all. And we hope to see you. You can join us in July when the next GT-BOP Green webinar is. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. And thank you to the Center for Urban Ag for putting this together.
Thanks, Bodhi. Thanks, Erich. Everyone, please go ahead and send us your sign-in sheets. And again, that email is gtbop@uga.edu. And if you need to mail us to them physically, the mailing address is at the top of your sign-in sheet.